Hello, my name is Jaru, and today I'm talking about Deltarune. There will be major spoilers for both Deltarune and Undertale, so please play them both before watching this. Certain files within Deltarune are unique in that they are completely capitalized. This makes them stand out, as most files are all lowercase. I am of the belief that all of these capitalized files are tied to Gaster in one way or another, and this series, the Gaster Files, will focus on exploring the significance of these files in depth. Today's episode will focus entirely on analyzing the capitalized audio tracks. Before I get into it though, I'd just like to take a moment to mention my Patreon. If you could spare even a single dollar a month, it would go a long way towards keeping my channel running. If you can't afford it, that's fine too. Just the fact that you're watching my content is more than enough support for me. First things first, here is a list of all the capitalized audio tracks in Deltarune. For those listening to this video in another tab or while driving, I'll go ahead and read them out loud. These files are Audio Appearance, Audio Intro Noise, Audio Another Hymn, Audio Darkness, Audio Defeat, Audio Drone, Audio Story, Gallery, KEYGEN, and The Holy. With this list established, I'll go ahead and explain what all these tracks are. Audio Appearance is the sound that plays when the red soul appears during the vessel creation sequence. Audio Intro Noise is the track that plays when you start the game. It's the part that has a strange voice saying Deltarune. Audio Another Hymn is the background music that plays during the vessel creation sequence. It is known simply as Another Hymn on the OST. Audio Darkness is the song that plays when you get a game over and choose to not continue. The mysterious voice then tells us that the world was covered by darkness and this song plays. It is known as Darkness Falls on the OST. Audio Defeat is a sort of 8-bit version of Darkness Falls, and it plays on the standard game over screen that got added in Chapter 2. It's called Fate Courage on the OST. Audio Drone is the background sound that plays in certain menu screens, notably the Chapter Select screen and the Chapter 1 Game Over screen. Audio Story is known as Before the Story on the OST, and it plays on the regular File Select screen. It's also one of my favorite songs by Toby Fox. Gallery is known as The Gallery on the OST, and it has been played twice thus far. The first occurred when King was threatening Lancer, and the other occurred in a similar scene with Queen and Birdley. KEYGEN is the track that plays when you repeatedly ask Spamton about the KEYGEN. This track is just called KEYGEN on the OST. And lastly is The Holy, which is the song that plays when you approach a dark fountain in either chapter. It is just called The Holy on the OST. Now, it seems pretty obvious to just about everyone that all these songs are connected to the mysterious person who speaks to us during the vessel creation sequence. And of course, most folks believe this person is Gaster. However, since we don't know for certain it's Gaster, I'll just call this person Mystery Man, since he is a mystery and the track Another Hymn refers to him as male. Or rather, that's what I was going to call him when I originally wrote this script, but when I brought up my decision to call him that in the last video, the comments didn't like it. They said it was the stupidest idea ever conceived by man, so never mind. Since calling him Mystery Man makes me stupid and calling him Gaster will have people throwing a fit because they hate Gaster, I'll just come up with a new Jaru brand name for this unnamed character. This strange, mysterious intro man who is definitely not Gaster will henceforth be referred to as Jeff. There shall be no discussion or debate, no arguments about it being confusing. This is his name now. Ahem. With all that said, not everyone is as versed in the lore as us theorists, so I'll go ahead and point out how exactly all these tracks tie back to Jeff. The files that begin with audio are inherently tied to each other by their naming convention, so let's start with those. Appearance, Another Hymn, and Drone are all played during conversations with Jeff, while Defeat is played immediately before he speaks to us, and Darkness is played immediately after he speaks to us. Additionally, Defeat is known as Faint Courage on the OST, which is similar to a menu theme called Faint Glow. You'll see why that's relevant in a moment. Intro noise and story are connected due to them playing on or between main menus, and those main menus are themselves connected to Jeff. Allow me to elaborate. The chapter select screen is connected thanks to Audio Drone playing behind it, which is a track that plays in other Jeff scenes. Additionally, the file select screen has an alternate version of itself that you can access, and this version has Jeff giving commentary on how we interact with the save files. And of course, the game over screen is heavily tied up with Jeff, as we've already discussed. In short, intro noise and story are connected to Jeff because they're connected to main menus. Main menus are connected to Jeff due to his presence within those menus. That is why Faint Courage having a similar name to Faint Glow, a menu song, is noteworthy. Next, I'll explain how Gallery, KEYGEN, and The Holy are tied to Jeff. Gallery and The Holy are connected due to them being used in scenes where we are standing in front of a dark fountain. Dark fountains are connected to Jeff due to them being animated with this sprite. This sprite is used in the fountains and in the intro vessel creation sequence. That only leaves KEYGEN. KEYGEN is connected because it's played by Spampton. Spampton is well established to have made contact with a mysterious person. This mysterious caller has been connected to Gaster due to a phone call with that person being described with the term garbage noise. Garbage noise has been used to describe the audio track known as SND_smile. This is the audio that plays in the entry 17 file from Undertale. This file is believed to have been made by W.D. Gaster due to it being in a lab report in Wingdings and W.D. being theorized to be short for Wingdings. Gaster in turn has a theme with a simple leitmotif. This simple leitmotif appears heavily in the various songs connected to Jeff, most notably Another Hymn. This, as a result, connects KEYGEN to Jeff. Did you keep track of all that? Here's the short version. KEYGEN connects to Spampton. Spampton connects to Mystery Person connects to Gaster Stuff, and Gaster Stuff is connected to Jeff. It's only now that I realize what an absolute mountain of assumptions one has to stand on to discuss anything even remotely connected to Gaster. Hilariously, all of this discussion was just the preamble necessary for you to understand why these audio tracks are important. I haven't even gotten to my thoughts, theories, and discoveries yet. And yes, I do actually have things to say about every single one of these tracks, so let's get into it. Audio appearance has a lot of major implications. The fact that the sound of the soul appearing is being directly tied to Jeff suggests that he is somehow responsible for said soul appearing. How incredible this feat is and what further implications arise from it depend on whose soul you think it is. Namely, do you think it belongs to the player, or do you think it belongs to another character in universe like Chris? If you believe this is the player's soul, that implies Jeff, a fictional character, has somehow transcended fiction in order to summon a real human being to the world of Deltarune. That is insane. No, seriously, it's literally insane because that's not possible. Toby Fox can write a story where he pretends that's possible, but it actively assaults my suspension of disbelief due to it applying a narrative to my real life that I know isn't true. To be clear, I can't prove this soul doesn't belong to the player. I can't prove that's not the story Toby Fox is trying to tell. If you want to believe that's the player's soul, I have no hard evidence proving that's wrong. All I can do is present my reasoning for why I think that interpretation doesn't work from a narrative standpoint. The first issue is the one I just mentioned. It's not possible for a fictional character to influence the real world. So if Toby Fox tries to tell a story where he pretends otherwise, that will shatter my immersion. I can suspend my disbelief when it comes to a fictional world. I can believe that monsters and magic and fantasy exist in the confines of a fictional setting. I cannot pretend that a magic Jeff inside a video game reached through my monitor to rip out my soul and take it to the Deltarune world. That didn't happen, and there's nothing Toby Fox can do to make me believe otherwise. As such, if my belief in this narrative as being reasonable is essential to me enjoying it, then this being my soul would destroy the story right out the gate. The second major issue with this reading is how it impacts the fictional setting. You see, currently all evidence points to the primary antagonist of Deltarune being Jeff. This is due to him very directly filling the same role as Flowey did in Undertale. Both Flowey and Jeff took over the official Undertale Deltarune Twitter account immediately before their respective games were released. Both Flowey and Jeff are the first entities you encounter in said games. Both characters act friendly towards you initially, but then turn nasty towards the end. They also both spout off some pessimistic philosophy that we are meant to oppose. Namely, Flowey's kill or be killed, and Jeff's nobody can choose who they are in this world. Our encounter with these entities is then brought to a sudden end by Toriel. We then never directly interact with these entities again for the majority of the game. Obviously, Deltarune isn't finished yet, so Jeff could still show up in the flesh during the next chapter or two. But so far, Jeff has followed the same trend as Flowey. He has also, much like Flowey, followed the trend of influencing things behind the scenes, with him manipulating bosses and making cameos in places like on your phone. This is similar to how Flowey manipulates Papyrus, actively stalks Frisk, and is directly mentioned by Sans. Flowey and Jeff are also established to be highly meta entities with powers nobody else possesses. Deltarune is explicitly stated to be a parallel story to Undertale, and nobody is currently paralleling Flowey to the same degree as this man. This would normally be great, as Jeff is sizing up to be a fascinating main antagonist. However, this all falls apart once you suggest Jeff is capable of summoning real humans and transcending fiction. If that is true, it completely breaks the narrative. In Undertale, Flowey was powerful, but he was still constrained by the rules of the Undertale universe. He could only ascend to godhood using the power of souls, which is a power other characters also possess. This allowed Frisk and their friends to actually put up a fight and ultimately defeat Flowey. This is not possible with Jeff. If he can transcend fiction, then there's nothing other fictional characters can do. He is beyond the scope of their entire reality, so the only one who could actually do anything to him would be the player. However, by taking this route and pitting the player versus Jeff, it completely undermines the stakes of the rest of the story. Chris, Ralsei, Chloe, Susie, and everyone else simply don't matter in this conflict. They cannot contribute anything to this battle because they aren't real, while Jeff somehow is. The only way you could work around this would be by allowing other Deltarune characters to transcend fiction as well, but that just exacerbates the problem. You could maybe sell the idea that Jeff transcended fiction to some players. You couldn't sell it to me, but I'm sure some of you watching at home might be willing to play along with that sort of story. However, it's one thing to expect your audience to believe one character achieved the impossible. It's a whole other matter to try and sell the idea of multiple characters doing this. Jeff transcending fiction to steal my soul is absurd and impossible, but you might be able to sell the idea that he can do it because he's special. You absolutely cannot sell the idea that Chris and friends can do this too. Also, this idea of a final showdown between the player and Jeff is way too meta for me to believe that's what Toby is going for. Toby likes having a meta-narrative, sure, but it's never super in your face. He pokes the fourth wall, but he doesn't shatter it entirely except in very rare cases. Flowey was a meta character, but the whole game he spends talking to Frisk. He only bothers to address the player one time at the very end of True Pacifist. Similarly, the fallen child doesn't address the player directly until the very end of Genocide. However, in both of these cases, it was a one-off bit of dialogue and not some ultra-meta final showdown. And just because Flowey and the fallen child are aware of the player doesn't mean they understand who or what we are. It also doesn't mean they can directly interact with the real world. This soul belonging to the player and being summoned by Jeff isn't just Toby Fox being meta, it's Toby Fox being vastly more meta than he's ever been before. Maybe that's the story he's going for, and it'll somehow work out despite my doubts. However, for the time being, I find this interpretation dubious at best. If this soul doesn't belong to the player, then the other option is that it belongs to a fictional character in the Deltarune world. As for which character it belongs to, there's a strong argument for it belonging to Chris. Chris also has a red soul, but more importantly, immediately after this intro scene ends, we transition to controlling Chris. If this is the correct order of events, then that suggests Jeff was able to teleport Chris's soul all the way from the light world into the dark world. That's a pretty crazy display of power if that's the case. However, this interpretation is not bulletproof. For one, Chris having a red soul doesn't guarantee that this soul and their soul are one and the same. It's completely feasible that different humans could have souls with the same color. It's even implied in Undertale that the fallen child also has a red soul, just like Frisk. Heck, given this is a different world, for all we know, the souls of monsters in Deltarune may even look like human souls as well. Furthermore, the fact that these two scenes are shown to us consecutively doesn't mean they actually occur one after the other. This is a trick Toby Fox has pulled in the past, specifically with the intro of Undertale. In that game, we are shown an intro cutscene in which a human climbs the mountain and then falls into the underground. We then input our name and it cuts to us controlling Frisk, implying that the scene we just watched was of our character. However, this is a trick. We later learn that the scene we witnessed was the story of the fallen child, who arrived in the underground years, if not centuries, before Frisk. Side note, I'm referring to the fallen child as the fallen child instead of Kara for a reason. It has come to my attention that the long-held fan belief that Kara was the true name of the fallen child isn't nearly as concrete as I was led to believe. The only reason we thought this was the case was because the game calls Kara the true name if you type it in. However, in the game files of Undertale, the Frisk sprite is referred to as main Kara, the fallen child sprite is referred to as true Kara, and this unused human sprite is referred to as Kara. The whole meta-narrative surrounding Kara as a name is that it's short for character, with all the humans just being different characters in this story. The genocide fallen child is literally a demonic manifestation of a certain type of video game mindset. Point is, nothing is more meta than the narrative surrounding this child. As such, it seems far more likely to me that Kara being the true name was just meant to be a meta nod on on Toby's part. This honestly makes more sense to me than him forcing his own preferred name for the fallen child onto the fanbase. That's not relevant to Gaster at all, I just thought I'd bring it up real quick because I thought it was interesting. The Undertale fanbase really loves reiterating headcanon to the point that people forget it's headcanon. The Undertale intro scene was designed to trick us into thinking the beginning bit, where we watch a cutscene and then name a character, was all about our protagonist. In reality, the character we watched and named was not the character we play as. As such, it's entirely possible that Deltarune's intro scene was also a trick. After all, Deltarune has us meeting and naming a character who we then don't play as, just like in Undertale. It's entirely possible that this scene with the vessel creation is happening to some other character and not Chris. Or alternatively, it's also possible this sequence did happen to Chris, but it happened a long time ago and they're just dreaming about it. However, regardless of where or when this event occurred, the fact that Jeff is capable of summoning souls in any way at all is pretty terrifying. That implies some pretty advanced powers or technology are at his disposal. Of course, I have my own interpretation of this sequence, which I will share now. You can consider the following to be my first theory of the video. I am of the belief that this scene is very much meant to be a parallel to Undertale. I think this sequence happened to some other character and not Chris, just like how the Undertale intro sequence was all about the fallen child instead of Frisk. I believe this is hinted at by the fact that if you name the vessel or creator Chris, then Jeff has nothing unique to say about it. For those not aware, Jeff has a special reaction if you name the vessel or creator any of these names. For the vessel, he says it's an interesting coincidence, and for the creator, he says it's very interesting. The only caveat is if you specifically named the creator Chris, Susie, or Noelle. In that context, Jeff says we're about to meet someone very, very wonderful. As interesting as all that is, none of those sentiments really make sense if the character he's talking to is Chris. After all, how could Chris meet Chris? If anything, this commentary suggests that whoever we're playing as is about to be introduced to the hometown for the first time. Or at the very least, that's what Jeff wanted them to believe. Given how this scene ends, it's quite possible that the character we're playing as was tricked and was led into this scenario under false pretenses. But that's not the end of my interpretation. I think it is quite feasible that Toby Fox anticipated us predicting this intro sequence was a trick. As such, I think Toby is pulling a double trick. Not only is the scene not actually occurring immediately before the Chris scene, but I don't think it's occurring before the Chris scene at all. I think this intro sequence with Jeff is actually a flash forward into the future. I think this intro sequence will happen much later, after the roaring has come to pass, and it will happen to someone who isn't Chris. Next is audio intro noise. The main suggestion this track gives is that the voice we hear saying Deltarune is either the voice of Jeff or is a machine speaking on his behalf. That would make a fair bit of sense, as just before the game launched, he also called out to Deltarune on Twitter. This also further emphasizes that Jeff exists in the main menus of the game, what with him speaking on the title screen. That said, while I do have some pretty major theories about what the Deltarune itself is, I don't have any major theories about this particular sequence. Next is audio another hymn. There are two main suggestions presented by this theme. The first is that whoever this Jeff is, he's related to Gaster in some way, as Gaster's leitmotif is very prominently featured in this track. The second major suggestion comes from the title. By having another as part of it, that suggests whoever this man is, he's another version or iteration upon something we've seen before. This is hard to interpret any other way except as a reference to Undertale, as we hear this song at the very beginning of the game. We haven't met any other Deltarune characters at this point, so there's no other people for Jeff to be another of. That just leaves Undertale as the only likely thing this could be referencing. If you accept that interpretation, that still leaves the door open regarding who Jeff is. All we know is that he's male, he's intelligent, and he's powerful. He may also be manipulative and a liar if you assume this ending line is also from him. Some folks theorize this is a different character who cuts in and discards the vessel, but it's open to interpretation. Regardless, that still doesn't clarify the man's identity. He could be another Flowey, as he does seem to fill many of the same roles Flowey did in Undertale. He could be another Sans, as Sans is intelligent, powerful, and mysterious. He could also, of course, be another Gaster, as he not only shares many of the same speaking patterns as Gaster, but he also has Gaster's leitmotif appearing in another hymn. There's also the extremely important detail of what Gaster's theme is called in Undertale. In the files of that game, Gaster's theme is called mus_st_hymn. As for my opinion, I do think Jeff is Gaster, although I don't think he is the same Gaster as the one from Undertale. I think Jeff is the Gaster of this reality, while the Gaster of the Undertale reality only exists in the Undertale universe. You can consider this to be my second theory of the video, although admittedly plenty of other people have theorized this before me. Next is audio darkness. What's interesting about this piece is that it only plays on the game over screen, despite darkness as a concept being heavily associated with Jeff. The main scene we interact with him is implied to be occurring inside a dark fountain, or maybe even inside the place that dark fountains come from. So the fact that we only get the darkness theme on a game over screen when he says the whole world is covered by darkness is fascinating. It's like this theme isn't really about him. It's like it's a requiem for Earth itself. But more importantly, the fact that he says this only after we give up implies that we, playing as Chris, have some control over the fate of this world. That seems to line up with how the prophecy depicts us. However, this could once again be a trick. Not only have we already established that Jeff may have a habit of lying and or manipulating people, but Toby Fox has also historically used game over screens to mislead us. In Undertale, the famous game over line telling us to stay determined is later revealed to have been said not to Frisk, but to the fallen child. This fact is further iterated upon as in Chapter 2, we get a more typical don't give up message from Susie or Ralsei on the new game over screen. I don't know about you, but showing a normal game over with messages directed at Chris just makes this other game over feel all the more out of place. As for my theory on this topic, I am inclined to believe that this original game over screen is not directed at Chris. I think this game over message is another line from Jeff to whoever he was talking to during the intro sequence. Furthermore, instead of Jeff trying to convince Chris that they can decide the fate of the world, this now instead suggests that Jeff was trying to convince some other human that they were important. Of course, Jeff may have already proven himself to be a liar and a manipulator, so whether this unknown human could actually save the world is a matter of debate. Either way, this message acting as a follow-up to them cooperating in the intro seems to imply to me that Jeff gave this human an important mission. A mission that would require a new vessel for their soul. What this mission was and why they needed such a vessel is a whole other can of worms that I'm not quite ready to open. Audio Defeat is a track that is easy to dismiss as just being another iteration of Darkness Falls. However, I don't think that's the case. Toby wouldn't make a whole extra game over song for no reason, just like he wouldn't make a whole new game over screen for no reason. This track, being called Faint Courage, is interesting in its own right, as Courage is the name of the power Chris unlocks when fighting in front of dark fountains. This suggests that Faint Courage is meant to be a theme associated with Chris, which makes sense, as the Undertale game over theme was called Determination, which was the power associated with Frisk. Furthermore, this file being called Defeat instead of Death, Game Over, or anything else is interesting, as it hammers home that this is not the end. You were defeated, but you weren't destroyed. It's just a loss in a video game, not the end of the world. You can reload and try again, hence why you have Susie and Ralsei encouraging you to not give up. This brings up another layer of potential trickery on Toby Fox's part. We already discussed how this dialogue from Jeff could actually be him talking to to another character in a different time period. But what about this dialogue from Susie and Rouse? Well, notably, their dialogue only plays if you have them in your party. If you die alone, no encouragement is given, which seems to imply that this dialogue is in fact being said to Chris in the present day. However, there are some issues with this interpretation. In order to get a game over, all characters have to drop their HP to below 0. So how could Rouse and Susie be talking if they're dead or unconscious? Maybe their souls are somehow speaking to us? A bit outlandish, but not impossible. We do know that our souls are connected to some degree, hence why we take collective battle damage, and souls communicating with each other has seemed to occur in previous games. Although, this would require that Rouse has a soul, which is not something we've established as being possible for a Darkner. Then again, maybe this is suggesting that Chris, as the leader of the party, is the only one who has to die in a game over scenario, while Susie and Rouse are brought back to life upon our death? Again, outlandish, but not impossible. Lastly, it could just be Toby Fox pulling his same old trick, and these lines from Rouse and Susie will actually be used later in the story. Just because they have to be present for their game over lines to play doesn't mean those lines have to be playing in the present day. It's a game over screen after all. There's no hard and fast rules for how this works. However, where things get a little more confusing is with Jeff. This theme is connected to him, yet it's unclear why there are two of them from a lore perspective. Music is symbolic. It represents characters and ideas, so why would there need to be two game over themes for the same person in the same scenario? What changed so substantially between chapters to justify this musical development? When the Empty Town theme was replaced with the My Castle Town theme, it was because a whole bunch of people moved in. The town was fleshed out, so the music was as well. But if that's what's happening with the game over track, what change could have justified it? And why do both songs still play if you choose to not continue? Why isn't it just one or the other? I'll be honest, unlike previous tracks, I'm having a hard time seeing what Jeff-related deductions a regular player can make about this file. You see, in this video, I've tried to divide my analysis of these tracks between regular analysis that normal players can understand and Jaru analysis, which focuses on abstract theories that most people don't agree with. But with Audio Defeat, I'm not sure what kind of regular analysis I can provide. I have my own theory, of course, but I'm not sure how the typical player should or could interpret this. I guess most players would just assume that there is no deeper meaning to this song's inclusion. This is a demo, after all, so maybe Toby Fox added a new game over song due to him not being satisfied with the old one. Although, why he includes both songs if you choose to not continue doesn't quite make sense with that reading. Or maybe you could conclude that this song was added due to Susie and Rouse being friends with Chris in this chapter, whereas they weren't in the previous chapter. Although, if that's the logic, I'm not sure why this game over screen wouldn't be added near the end of chapter 1, as Susie befriends us before we reach the end of that story. Alternatively, maybe normal players think Toby intends to add a new game over screen every chapter to keep things fresh, and there's nothing deeper to it than that. Feel free to let me know what you think of this track in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious, as I'm not really sure what the normal perspective is on this particular track. As for my own theory on this song, this is where things get complicated. You see, as you'll recall, I think the original game over screen was not directed at Chris and was instead directed at some other human. By contrast, I think the exact opposite is the case with this new game over screen. I think this one is custom built with Chris in mind, hence why we have their friends inexplicably encouraging them to not give up. Why does Jeff double down on the game over songs? It's because the different different songs represent different relationships. Darkness Falls is for the unknown human character, while Faint Courage is for Chris. However, it goes deeper than that. You see, when listening to Faint Courage, I was struck by how similar it felt to another song featured in Deltarune. Specifically, it reminded me of Empty Town. This track is also 8-bit in style, and it also later gets adapted into a version with actual instruments. This parallel of having an 8-bit version and a regular version is shared with Darkness Falls and Faint Courage. This leads me to conclude that Rouse is responsible in some manner for this updated Game Over theme. You see, I always thought that the 8-bit instrumentation within Rouse-related songs like The Legend and Empty Town made them feel hollow and artificial, like Rouse was putting on a performance rather than trying to convey the objective truth. He comes across like he wants Chris and Susie to feel like important heroes with important destinies, no matter how true that sentiment is, and this Game Over screen contributes to that. Not only does Faint Courage feel like a hollow, fake, video gamey version of the original Darkness Falls, it also includes this new, dramatic Game Over text alongside our friends encouraging us. Rouse even insists that this isn't our destiny, just further trying to convince us of our supposed importance. This feels like it's Rouse trying to convince us that we're just as important to this world as Frisk was to the Undertale world, which, of course, has the effect of making me think he's lying. As longtime viewers of the channel are aware, I believe Deltarune is trapped in a time loop, and that's why characters like Jevil and Sham are nihilists who don't think our choices matter. By contrast, I argued in one of my previous videos that Rouse was lying to Chris and Susie about their importance. He did this in order to give them the illusion of freedom and happiness in what little time they had left. This new Game Over screen and song only further convince me of that. But wait, I'm not done yet. I further conclude that Rouse is tied to Jeff either directly or indirectly. My evidence for this is actually quite extensive, more so than most of my theories. Firstly, Rouse has secret information that he shouldn't, such as a prophecy of events to come and knowledge of secret mechanics like saving and loading. This is similar to how Jevil knew of the future events of Chapter 2 and how both he and Spampton seem to have been exposed to forbidden knowledge. Secondly, Rouse is literally called the Prince of the Kingdom of Darkness, which, as you'll recall, darkness is a concept heavily associated with Jeff. Thirdly, the legend that we hear from Rouse about the Delta Warriors has only been brought up one other time. Namely, on the Deltarune website back in 2016, a Wingdings message was found that directly quoted Rouse's prophecy. Rouse and Jeff are the only entities to acknowledge said prophecy thus far, which is indicative of them being connected. And fourthly, the fact that Rouse provides a cover of a Jeff-related song seems like pretty heavy foreshadowing that the two are connected. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying this is proof that Rouse and Jeff are in league with each other. I actually don't think that they are. As many other theorists have already suggested, I suspect Rouse is just like Jevil and Spampton, in that he encountered Jeff and was told some crazy stuff. He then discovered a shadow crystal which showed him more crazy stuff. I won't bother recapping how Rouse repeatedly demonstrates knowledge and foresight that he shouldn't have, as I already covered that in previous videos. However, I will go ahead and forward one final prediction about Rouse before I move on. Given his foresight, his knowledge of shadow crystals, and the fact that Sham says we'll need the Shadow Mantle to beat the Chapter 3 secret boss, I think Rouse will actually be the one to provide said Shadow Mantle. In other words, I think the reason Sham can't find the Shadow Mantle is because Rouse stole it. I think Rousseau foresaw that Chris wasn't guaranteed to befriend Sham, as Chris isn't exactly a social butterfly. This meant that Chris wouldn't be guaranteed to receive the Shadow Mantle. This could very well have led to an unpleasant experience if Chris then stumbled into an unwinnable boss fight against the next secret boss. As such, Rousseau stole it to ensure his dear friends wouldn't be forced to deal with such a scenario. Alright, I think I've gone on long enough about audio defeat. Audio drone is interesting because it suggests Gaster has a gas drone. Audio drone is interesting because it suggests the presence of some sort of machinery. The word drone means to make a continuous low humming sound. This term can be used to describe non-machinery sounds, but our options in this context are pretty limited. It plays on certain menus like the chapter select and game over screens, but it also plays in the intro sequence prior to another hymn. If you don't think it's Jeff making this sound, or the Dark World itself, then the only remaining option is that there's some off-screen machinery responsible for this noise. This is further emphasized by the track Another Hymn, as when you listen to it during this intro, the beginning portion sounds like a machine booting up. By contrast, Audio Drone sounds like a machine on standby, waiting to be activated. There are a plethora of references in the code to some sort of device, which is also referred to in all capital letters. This further supports the notion that Jeff is utilizing some sort of advanced machine. This machine could be responsible for the human soul appearing, it could also be responsible for this vessel being created, or it might be responsible for something else entirely. The fact that this noise plays during the game over sequence is fascinating though, as it could suggest that somehow we are still back at the Dark Fountain with Jeff and his machinery. This could suggest that some part of ourselves is still with Jeff, and that's how he's able to interact with us anytime we get a game over. Our connection, as he refers to it, is still there. The bottom line is that Audio Drone seems to imply Jeff has machinery droning in the background, although what kind of machinery and for what purpose is up to interpretation. As for my own theory, hold on to your butts, this one is a bit insane. I think the unknown human I mentioned earlier made a deal with Jeff to put their soul into a new vessel. This vessel would be necessary for them to accomplish some sort of mission to break the time loop. This human has had their body and soul separated by this device, and the drone sound is that of the machine that their body is being kept in. This is how Jeff is able to keep in contact with this human and take note when they get a game over. It's because he still has their body back in his lab. It's very much like the Matrix, with our body being in a tube while our mind is uploaded elsewhere. Only instead of our mind being uploaded into the Matrix, it's our soul being uploaded into a vessel. When the vessel dies, the human wakes back up in the tube, and Jeff then asks them if they'd like to continue with their mission. If they say no, then they have no hope of breaking the time loop and creating a new future. As such, the world is covered by darkness. I'm willing to bet that this human body inside a tube will be something we stumble across later on. And since Toby is such an Earthbound fan, I won't be surprised if this human body in a tube bears a striking resemblance to how Porky looked in his tube. That detail is just a minor prediction, but it's one I think is very on brand for Toby Fox. Next is Audio Story, and this one is fascinating. The name suggests this song is telling us the story of Deltarune, as it plays on the main menu. And boy, what an interesting story it has to tell. The first 28 seconds sound like this. This simple piano tune is morose, somber, and just generally sad. It sounds like the music that would play as you looked out over a devastated world. It sounds like the song that would play after the roaring has come and gone. It's the theme of a sad ending. But then, unexpectedly, the song changes. And stop me if you recognize the theme that comes in. Undertale. It's the Undertale main theme. How it's playing here in a completely different universe and what context this song is meant for, I don't know. But at the same time, I don't think you need to know. The music carries the emotional narrative even without the context. It's a story of standing at the edge of despair, only to be reminded of something. A memory, a story of humans and monsters, of crushing despair being beaten back through the power of hopes and dreams, of a story that couldn't, shouldn't have had a happy ending, yet it did. An ending, I might add, that I am distinctly reminded of looking at this art on Deltarune's main menu. The Undertale theme coming in feels like a lifeline, a reminder of the love we have in our hearts for that original beautiful story. Getting this theme here in the midst of such sorrowful tones makes it feel like Toby is reminding us of what joy is, what happiness is, and why we shouldn't give up. The Undertale theme that appears here still has a sad tone to it at first, but as the song progresses, angelic, uplifting tones arise. These tones are normally only heard in The Holy, aka the theme of the Dark Fountains, so to have them here feels like the song is framing Undertale, or perhaps the feelings Undertale gave us, as sacred, as something meaningful and important. To put it simply, Before the Story sounds like a track about the importance of maintaining your hopes and dreams during times of despair, as they can be your only lifeline. Beyond the more abstract musical analysis, we can also deduce a lot from the fact that Before the Story is the track's name. This song is characterizing a time or place before the events of some story. Which story? That's hard to say. It could be the story of Deltarune. But if so, why the sadness? What terrible thing happened to warrant this sorrow? If it's before the story of Undertale that this song is characterizing, then that could make a little sense, as everything was pretty hopeless in the underground before Frisk showed up. However, if that is the story this song is referencing, then why is it appearing in Deltarune? Remember, these are completely different worlds, and if this song is not referencing the stories of Undertale or Deltarune, then what story is it referring to? The player's story? That's pretty vague, and also pretty presumptuous. I might be depressed, but not every player is. Regardless, no matter how you interpret this, it's incredibly fascinating to have such a prominent Deltarune track contain the Undertale theme. This story is parallel to Undertale. It's not just some random AU that coincidentally features Undertale characters. These games and these stories are tied, and there are few ways to better convey such a fact than having the main theme of the previous game appear on the main menu of this game. What that entails for the narrative is hard to judge, but it is intriguing nonetheless. As for my theory on this song, I think it makes the most sense within the context of my time loop theory. This universe existed before the player showed up. That means this time loop and the story of that time loop existed as well. As such, I think Before the Story is discussing the story of Deltarune, but it's referring to how this screen with this art is what the world of Deltarune is currently experiencing. This scene is happening before the story because it's happening right before the timeline is reset, and that reset will cause the story of Deltarune to play out all over again. The music is telling us how they feel in this moment. They are at the end of their timeline. The roaring has come, their world is ending, and there's nothing they can do to stop it. They stare out over the dark fountain with sad piano music accompanying them. However, despite all this, their hopes and dreams have not been crushed. They still believe that a better tomorrow will come. They haven't given up their hope, and that's why the Undertale theme comes in. It symbolizes their somber yet strong determination to believe in a better tomorrow. At least that's my interpretation. Next is Gallery. This track was the one that inspired me to make this video in the first place, because it has some very interesting connotations. It only plays during scenes where we are standing in front of dark fountains, and the word gallery itself is pretty self-explanatory. A gallery is a platform from which you can observe something, and it's typically indoors. As such, the most straightforward and logical interpretation is that this song is referring to how this area is a gallery. To be more precise, it's a gallery from which someone can observe a dark fountain, as we see King doing when we first arrive. Shoutouts to Andrew Cunningham for pointing this interpretation out to me, as I was going down a much more elaborate rabbit hole initially. With that said, I do still have a theory to present. This theory has three parts. The first is that I believe dark fountains directly enhance the powers of anyone who gets close to them. This is supported by the fact that the only times we unlock our special super abilities is when we're directly in front of a dark fountain. It enhances us just as it enhances our enemies. The second aspect of this theory is with regards to Jeff. You see, this track is still connected to Jeff, who seems to dwell inside a dark fountain. And what do you know? This track only plays when the party is standing directly in front of dark fountains. As such, I think it is likely that Jeff is observing us directly during these situations. After all, Jeff has demonstrated a clear desire to manipulate the fate of this world, so the idea that he would want to spy on the Delta warriors and their enemies makes perfect sense. This leads to the third aspect of this theory. I think Jeff is interested in more than mere observation. I think manipulation is his aim, and I have a suspicion that he is manipulating King and Queen from inside the dark fountain. To be precise, I think Jeff is manipulating their emotions in order to make them more cruel and hostile. This theory first occurred to me when Toby Fox mentioned something interesting during the Deltarune livestream. He suggested that the Dark Fountain was somehow responsible for making King act more aggressive and violent than he normally would. King was always a jerk, but the fountain made him act even worse. This suggests that either the Dark Fountain or something within the Dark Fountain can manipulate emotions. Case in point, before the Dark Fountain showed up, King was just one of several kings. After the Dark Fountain showed up, he overthrew the other rulers and became a terrifying tyrant that everyone hated. Before the Cyber World Dark Fountain appeared, Queen was a bossy egotist, but one who still genuinely cared about the Lightners. She didn't hate them the way King did. She actually wanted them to be happy. However, after the Dark Fountain appeared, Queen became substantially more tyrannical and oppressive. She started trying to imprison Lightners, she used another Lightner as a meat shield, and she even threatens to kill Susie if Noelle doesn't do what she wants. Regardless of whether she'd actually kill anyone, this is still way more hostile than her former characterization would imply she's capable of. The Sweet Cap'n Cakes outright state that the Dark Fountain made Queen worse, and yet nobody else is accused of becoming more villainous. Surely the Dark Fountain would make a couple people act out of character, right? And yet, it doesn't. The only people it seems to make worse are King and Queen. I think this is because the Dark Fountains don't actually alter your behavior. They only enhance your abilities. King and Queen becoming worse is the fault not of the Fountains, but of Jeff. I think Jeff is using some unknown power to manipulate their emotions and behavior. Why is Jeff doing this? Well, it could be he wants to stop the Delta Warriors, or it could be he wants the Delta Warriors to be strong enough to bring about a new future. Both options are perfectly viable at this point in time, but it's hard to guess further given how little we know about Jeff's motivations. Next is KEYGEN. The capitalization of this track actually answers something that I had been wondering about during my Spampton analysis. The goal of Spampton was to break into Queen's mansion, but doing that required getting past Queen's defenses. Notably, that includes this lock, which is described as being, quote, seemingly impossible to open. And yet, despite being the highest quality of defense at Queen's disposal, Spampton somehow has a program that can open it. I don't know if you noticed, but the vast majority of objects in Spampton's possession are complete trash. He's very down on his luck and has next to no resources. As such, how on earth could he have access to the highest tier of hacking programs if he doesn't even have a bed? The answer seems to be that Spampton was given this program by Jeff. That's why this song is all capitalized. That's why this insane homeless man has access to the Deltarune equivalent of nuclear launch codes. He's a pawn in the game of someone far more powerful. And honestly, I don't think any of this is particularly speculative. I think even an average player who never touches the game's code could deduce that Spampton was being manipulated by a powerful figure. KEYGEN being capitalized only really serves to hint at that powerful figure being Jeff. As for why this song sounds the way it does and has Spampton turning rainbow colored, the popular belief is that this is a reference to some sort of old internet meme, and I'm honestly not inclined to argue with that. I don't see any better reason for this to happen, and given how short and basic Gallery was, I think it's safe to say not all Jeff-related songs are super deep on a musical level. As for my theory on KEYGEN, this one's a bit out of left field, but I think KEYGEN is connected to the mysterious friend. Go check out this video if you'd like to learn more about my theory on this friend and their identity. But for now, long story short, this face, which appears in Queen's basement, is also described with all caps in the files, and is thus connected to Jeff. I speculated in my other video that I think this entity is a spy sent by Jeff, and that theory is what I'm expanding on here. Not only do I think Jeff is the one who created the KEYGEN, but I also think he programmed it to alert him should it ever be used. Upon being alerted that Chris had unlocked Queen's basement, Jeff sent the friend to spy on them. He was curious who had finally used that program he gave to Spampton ages ago. Or maybe this was all part of Jeff's plan. If this world really is in a time loop and Jeff is tied to these shadow crystals, then maybe Jeff knew all this would happen. Maybe he gave Spampton the KEYGEN specifically because he knew it would make its way to Chris someday. It's hard to say what his plan was here, but there are plenty of interesting possibilities. And last, but certainly not least, is the Holy. Out the gate, there are two definitions that the word holy can possess depending on the context. The first definition is dedicated or consecrated to God or a religious purpose, sacred. The second definition is used in exclamations of surprise or dismay. Most examples of this word being used in Deltarune are with the exclamation definition in mind. Holy Kungadero is the main offender, but Queen manages to sneak one in with Holy Circuits. Ignoring the exclamations, there's really only 3 instances in which the divine definition of holy is being used. The first is, of course, this track. From context alone, it really only makes sense for this to be referring to the religious definition. The Darkners worship the Lighteners as gods, and as we've seen, Lighteners are the only ones who typically create dark fountains. This emphasizes the idea that these fountains are not only supernatural in nature, but are specifically associated with the divine. It is thus no small surprise that the 2 other instances of holy being used in this way involve dark fountains. The first is King, who refers to the dark fountains as holy. This seems to make sense, but given that King hates Lighteners and doesn't worship them anymore, it is kinda odd that he'd refer to the fountain as holy. Actually, considering his crestfallen nature, I'm surprised he'd refer to anything as holy. Could this be another instance of Jeff manipulating him? Or is the Roaring Knight such a charismatic figure that they inspire worship in those who encounter it? I'm not sure. The final instance of holy being used is a little more obscure, as it's when Birdley refers to his halberd as the Holy Halberd. However, as absurd as it sounds, this does still tie back to the Dark Fountains, as this halberd is the implement Birdley almost used to open a Dark Fountain at the end of Chapter 2. In fact, it's entirely possible that he refers to it as holy because Queen told him that it was. After all, she's entirely in favor of creating more dark fountains for most of this chapter. Overall, the usage of holy in this track, and in reference to the dark fountains, makes sense within the culture of Darkners, but there are certainly some questions left unanswered. Why does King still think the fountains are holy if he hates Lighteners? Why does Jeff think the fountains are holy? What connection or relevance does Jeff have to the concept of the divine? Does Jeff himself worship these things, or is he simply aware that these fountains originate from some powerful supernatural entity? Is this all tied up with the angel's heaven from Rousseau's prophecy? We know Jeff is associated with that prophecy, so that's not hard to believe. However, given what little information we currently have, I think that's about as far as objective analysis can take us. That, of course, brings me to my theory on the holy. Naturally, with all this discussion on the divine, it was inevitable I'd draw connections based on my angel theory. For those not in the know, I've theorized in past videos that the entity responsible for this time loop is the entity referred to as the angel. It's the angel whose heaven we seek to banish in the prophecy. I also theorized that the angel was responsible for the creation of the darkness that dark fountains are made of. I argued that the dark world is effectively another dimension, and it was created to be a place where the angel could store all the magic it had stolen from the monsters. The downside of this strategy was that anyone who tore open a hole into this dimension caused the darkness within to come pouring out. This is what dark fountains actually are. They are holes in the barrier between dimensions. But more importantly for this theory, the dark fountains would deserve the connotation of being holy even in the eyes of Jeff because they are effectively a creation of the angel. If there's no angel, then there's no darkness. And if there's no darkness, then there's no dark fountains. Ergo, dark fountains are a byproduct of the angel and are thus holy by association. This interpretation can pretty readily provide answers to the many questions I just brought up. Why does King consider the fountains to still be holy despite no longer worshipping lighteners? Because he has a new god now, in the form of the angel and its emissary, the Roaring Knight. Jeff, on the other hand, likely thinks these fountains are holy purely in a technical sense. The angel is a godlike entity, and so the fountains are holy as an extension of that. Alternatively, if Jeff seeks to overthrow the angel and become a god himself, then he may view the fountains as being the key to that. This, in turn, is what makes them holy in his mind. It's hard to judge Jeff's motivations at this stage, obviously, but there are plenty of reasons for him to view these fountains with reverence. But with that, we've finished my analysis of all the Gaster-related music files in Deltarune. There was a lot to unpack here, but I also think we reached a lot of interesting conclusions. Even if you ignore my theories and focus on the more objective analysis, Toby Fox is still providing some fascinating ideas for us to explore. I hope you guys felt the same. With that, it's time for me to sign off. A massive thanks go out to my patrons for their very generous support. A special shout out goes to E-Roll, Hannah Brown, Suit Number 1, and a Switch Dog. And a very special shout out goes to Super CKX7 for being the only one to support me on the Ralsei tier. My deepest thanks go out to all of you for supporting me in this way. You are far too kind, and it really does me and my family a lot of good. Thank you very much. Like if you enjoyed the video, comment if you've got something to say, subscribe if you want to see more, and as always, have a fantastic day.